I wasn't nervous enough, I've just seen Ken Frampton slip into the front row to make me even more nervous. I'm going to show two projects. It's always difficult to know how to explain one's work, but I decided to show two projects in two different cities. One is in Berlin, and the other's in Mexico City. They're both museums, and they both deal with the concerns of cultural institutions who are trying to find an appropriate relationship with their place, both physically and socially. Both projects are particular to their own context, not only from an urban point of view, but I believe we have invested each project with qualities inspired by the more general cultural and physical conditions of the place. The two projects are the James Simon Gallery, also referred to as the entrance building on the Museum Island in Berlin, and the Jumex Museum in Mexico City. I choose these projects because they are recent works, one completed last year and the other still in construction. And I will try to explain how they sit within our ongoing work and what they share with what I might presumptuously refer to as our body of work. It's probably important to point out that even though they both aspire to hold civic posture, the Berlin project is a state-financed public building, while Jumex is a private institution assuming a public role. So this is the elevation, rather mundane-looking elevation of the James Simon Gallery. In the case of the James Simon Gallery, the building is part of our ongoing involvement in a city that, since the fall of the wall, which is now 25 years ago, is in a continuous process of reconstruction and reconsideration. It is a city overburdened by its history, and as a consequence, a city where everything seems to have meaning. Our work in the Noise Museum and on the James Simon Gallery put us in the very center of this highly articulated attitude of reflection. This is the Jumex building in Mexico City. Unlike the James Simon Gallery, which, as I will try to explain, we pulled out of the place, trying, as it were, to find a building in its own highly charged historical and overloaded context, Jumex is imposed, its form self-consciously asserting itself in a place that has no apparent urban order other than that which might emanate from the building itself. A site that confronts a very different type of context, a developing place with no apparent city plan, but rather an evolved development based on investment and overlaid with some architectural and cultural ambitions. These two situations refer on the one hand to the planned European city struggling with its history and trying to deal with new pressures of investment and development, and on the other, the free market, investor-led city that is now the condition of most city development. This is the Museum Island in Berlin. And the James Simon Gallery is one of a series of projects on or around the Museum Island, and one of the projects that are strongly related to what one might grandly call the reconstruction of Berlin. This is a Museum Island. In the front, you see Schinkel's great Alters Museum. Behind that, still in its ruined condition, is the Stüller's Noise Museum. Just to the right is the Old National Gallery, then is the Pergamon, and then the Bode Museum. In the forefront, you see the cathedral, and we are hovering above the site of the Schloss, which will again contain the reconstructed Schloss. More about that later. Just go back. You can see that when Schinkel built the Alters Museum, it faced across the Lustgarten to the Schloss. It was a building absolutely in relation to the castle, with the cathedral on one side, the university on the other. So you had the king, you had the church, you had the university, and actually you had the military behind. The expansion of the museums required a rather clever device, which you can see here, sort of colonnade. So in fact, the way to arrive at the next group of buildings is in a way around the side of the Alters Museum. So this device, which I'll show you, here it is the colonnade, which in a way combined the front of the Neues Museum, combine the front of the Neues Museum, which is right here, and created a unifying space within which the National Gallery sat. These two buildings then created a relationship, as it were, over or by the side of the Alters Museum towards Unter den Linden and the Schloss. So here we see this cultural center, in a way, sort of explicit temple architecture, separate buildings combining together to form a campus of museums, integrating gardens, courtyards, a sort of civilized vision, colonnades, giant stairs, architecture at an urban scale, developed over more than 100 years. The last building being Alfred Messel's Pergamon Museum, finally completed in 1930 by Ludwig Hoffmann. The collection of museums that began with Schinkel's Alters Museum was initiated through the vision of Frederick William IV, the patron of both Carl Friedrich Schinkel and Schinkel student Friedrich August Stüller. It's obviously a good career move to call yourself Frederick in those days. His vision, captured in this sketch, suggests a sort of Athens on the Spree, the cultural heart of the new Prussian Empire, sort of temples on temples. And in a way, this is sort of what happened. The war destroyed Berlin, and while much was rebuilt, the gaps remained, especially in the east. And on the museum island, the Neues Museum, closed in 1939, bombed in 1942, and again in 1945, remained as a ruin. While the other structures of the museum island were rebuilt, the Neues Museum spent 60 years developing itself into a fine ruin. This was roughly the condition when we won the competition to rebuild it in 1997. So you can see the other buildings were rebuilt. They were similarly badly damaged, but Neues Museum, for reasons which are complicated, but I will try and explain later, sat there. You can see that the whole northwest wing was completely lost, the old Egyptian courtyard. You can see the southwest wing was bombed. The top two floors were completely lost. Half the facade was lost. And this damage went all the way down to the ground floor. The staircase hall was completely bombed and lost. The east side of the building was in a much better state than the rest. The destruction of the center of Berlin was nearly total, hardly a building intact, only walls. Here's the Brandenburg Gate, Unter den Linden stretching out in front of you, with the Schloss would be right at the end. So this photograph was taken before the destruction of the Schloss in 1958. So you can see Pariser Platz, the sort of ruin of it, the American Embassy on the right-hand side. I mean, really extraordinary destruction. The museum island, effectively, if you look down this alley, this is Unter den Linden. The Schloss is at the end of that, and that's where the street turns towards Alexanderplatz, and that's the location of Museum Island. It is said that all cities have history, and Berlin has too much. As if the destruction of Berlin during the war wasn't enough, the partitioning of the Russian sector and the construction of the wall gave another challenge to this ruined city. The post-war division confused an already destroyed city. Desperate to rebuild itself, this poor place had to rebuild two parallel cities, and two cities of a highly representative nature. In other words, the task of West Berlin was, in a way, to defy everything that it had and create the illusion of a city, even though actually the real city was on the east side. Rarely could urban planning have been so burdened as in post-war partitioned West Berlin. With the fall of the wall in 1989, everything started all over again. So, you get the war, you get the division of the city, you get the development of the city in two halves with parallel institutions, two national galleries, two national libraries, and then it's taken down, and everything goes back to the beginning. This is an image from last November when they, interestingly, and anecdotally, of course, when the wall fell, the first thing people wanted to do was to get rid of any trace of it. So it was destroyed and taken away as much as possible. Of course, now what happens, everyone arrives in Berlin and says, "Where's the wall?" And so they're hastily in certain places trying to rebuild it. It's just to show you how confused Berlin is with its complicated history. And this was a light installation trying to retrace the location of the wall during the 25th anniversary celebrations last November. So the Berlin Wall divided the city, and the Russian sector that became part of the DDR effectively confiscated the center of the city, leaving the West with only the West End. And while the East held the historic heart and the major civic buildings, at least what remained of them, the West had to make a new city out of nothing, building not only a new society, but also a symbolic new city with a new national library, a philharmonia, a new national gallery, a new opera, etc., etc. The reunification involved not only the connecting back of the two parts of the city, but again the reintegration of all technical and cultural infrastructure. So you can imagine logistically this was an enormous task. Even things like sewage systems were separated. Obviously there was an urban task, but also there was there has been an enormous project to, in a way, rejoin all of these parallel institutions. A quick word on reconstruction and ruin. And nowhere has this problem been more articulated than in Germany. Since the post-war debate about the rebuilding of Goethe's house in Frankfurt, the Gedankniskirche in West Berlin by Egon Eyman, which this is, and in every one of these projects which dealt with either knocking a building down, in the case of the Schloss in East Germany, the retention of this church. Egon Eyman's initial idea was to take the building down, but he was forced to keep it. It's now become a landmark. So this is something that Germany, I mean, all Europe had to deal with, but Germany had to deal with it probably more than most. And in a very German way, they've articulated this question probably better than most. And here is someone that really knew what to do. This is Hans Dorgast in the Neue Pinakothek in Munich. An inspiration, because here we have Dorgast rebuilding immediately after the war, completing the form but not imitating the architecture. This became a great clue for us. But I would have to say that technique was not something that maintained, and instead over the last 15 years, I would say, we've seen a move towards historic reconstruction. And this is the Jurassic Park of all historic reconstructions, built out of a DNA fragment that they probably found in the ground. This completely simulated fake castle on the ground that was cleared by knocking down the building that replaced the building that the GDR knocked down. So there is a terrible, haunted feeling about the revisionist attitude of this site. So the Schloss remained, it was badly damaged, but it became an ideological decision to knock it down against the intellectual opposition in 1958. They then built the Palace of the Republic, a rather ugly building built by Swedish contractors in yellow aluminium, but however, an extraordinary typology, the most symbolic building of the seat of government, and a bowling alley and all sorts of other things. I mean, extraordinary typology, which was then knocked down when the wall came down, again for ideological reasons, and this is now being built for ideological reasons, to put back something which never existed. And of course, there is no king, so no one knows what's to go into it. But again, this shows you the confusion of this complex history. And this is in some ways the most fascinating city because of this. This is a fascinating city to work in. And we've worked in it for the last 15 years, and much of our work has been in the historic center of Mitte. The museum island is here. Here's where the Schloss will go. Unter den Linden is here. The Schloss will, I must say, urbanistically, it is missed. There's the Lustgarten Museum Island and various projects that I will very briefly show. The center of all of these projects has been the Neues Museum and the Museum Island. However, we have during this period carried out a number of small projects, all interventions into the fabric, mending, adding, making sense of, interventions that try to find an appropriate presence, a balance between repairing the fabric, which in a way is impossible, and the assertion of autonomous, architectural autonomous quality. The few projects that I were carried out over the last 10 years, and our attempts to find a way of operating within the context of history, war damage, post-war repair, and new development. So very briefly, I just want to show, before I show the James Simon Gallery, I want to show the context of these other projects, which have all been contributing in a way to our approach. So this was actually the first project we did. It was an old school in Friedrichstrasse. We did a very straightforward repair in some ways, but of course every every initiative, especially, this was 10 years ago, needed to become a development. Unless there's an economic viability. So no one is going around these buildings and saying just repair them. There is a process of development. And so the question is, how do you manage and negotiate between the responsibility of restoring buildings and at the same time the financial equation of giving them a new economy, a new life, a new program. In this case, rather nicely, the publishers, Ullstein, wanted to come back into Berlin, and they took over the building, and we prepared it for them. This is the sort of typical condition of East Berlin after the wall came down, while the West had really rebuilt in the East. You found this condition everywhere. In these projects, we are restoring, repairing, and adding to sometimes not, but they're all working very closely with the building, and in a way trying to optimize them and find them a new place within the city, and work within a general idea about what the city should be. This was the women's hospital, the Charité Hospital on the Spree, not very far from the Bode Museum, not far from Museum Island. This was the condition before the war, rather picturesque composition with these two towers and a pavilion on the riverfront. This is it after it's been through the war, after it's been through sort of GDR modernization or repair. This is the state that we found in it. Telecom wanted to move into it. So this is a most complicated collage of histories. And now, of course, in this complicated Berlin world, certain aspects of what the GDR did are historically important. So some terrible, very badly built pieces are now valued. So for instance, in this building, this window is valued by the conservation department as an example of a typical intervention of that period, as is the porch. So we have, it's difficult to imagine, but it is. So we have a sort of stripped down bit of the original building. We have an original building underneath here. We have interventions. We've lost the other tower, so it's a mess. That's it. Drawn, which looks better. But, and this is our project, so you can sort of see what we're up to. So we're trying to re-establish certain qualities of the original, which is the roof in the middle here, trying to get this back into a centralized composition as opposed to this which has been sort of neutralized. We've integrated the window. We've gone underneath this brickwork and found the original format of the windows. We don't believe to put a tower back here, but instead we balance this with a new building. And that's the new building. So as in the original, this composition which sat in the street but had one of its wings addressing the Spree, we redo that. This is our own office. So 10 years ago or so, we bought an old factory, which is the one at the back. This is a very Berlin hippie scene here, people sitting. That's our office. There's a slice of land which goes to the street, and this used to be a typical Hof courtyard system. So there was a front house, a courtyard. Where this little low building was, there was another building, then there was another courtyard, then there was another building, there was another courtyard. That's a system which happens very much in Berlin. We had lost, our site had none of that left, only the back building. So, interestingly, even though historically there would have been a courtyard here, and then a courtyard here, and then a courtyard here, after the war, the regulation is you can't put those back because the courtyards were very claustrophobic. So there isn't the regulation takes advantage of the fact that there's now, as it were, cross ventilation. So you shouldn't really recreate the historical condition. So you're collaging with these sort of elements that were there. The idea of trying to recreate what's missing is not appropriate. So our project was to rebuild the front house, reestablish the street, and then build 2 volumes that create a new courtyard and imply this layering, but by not filling up this space, keep this new found quality which the ruination had somehow exposed. And then that's the building to the street, our cafeteria, and the street itself. So the final project I want to talk about before James Simon is a building which is next to the museum island. It's the first new building we did in Berlin, in the center of Berlin. It's a gallery house on an empty site, literally overlooking the Lustgarten at the back of the National Gallery. And here is the building, complete, where we've tried to find a sort of relationship between completion of respecting, taking the urban block around, using mass to, in a way, replace the lost mass in brickwork, second-hand brickwork, which is then with a lime wash to sort of unify it. And at this point, I just want to say, I want to say something about building, which is a strange idea of just talking about building, but trying to put these slides together, it occurred to me, I was trying to understand to what degree this experience and the experience of Neues Museum has contributed to the way we work. And in summary, I want to talk about briefly the fact that working with old buildings or working within these historic conditions has put us very close to the process of building itself, which seems as an architect a slightly strange thing to say, because surely you're always close to building. But I believe we are at a time where it's harder than ever to engage with construction, of how we put buildings together. On larger buildings, other criteria take precedence. De-risking, de-skilling, speed of assembly. What we might call the industry tries to stop us getting involved. The quality that might come from making something seems to be increasingly unreliable. So we seem to have lost confidence in what we might call building well. In other words, given that I think it's fairly straightforward. How could you possibly hold on to such ideas if value engineering is an accepted part of design management. It's perhaps too simple to suggest, but I'll say it anyway, that the less confident we are in how something might be, in other words, how we realize it, the more we start to rely more on what it might look like. Coincident to that, we find ourselves in a culture and with a technology that allows us to be realistic, and I put that in inverted commas, about how a building might look. Clients demand that we use this dangerous tool. We can't speculate on how a building might be, but we can speculate on what it might look like. So the paradox: architecture, that is the physical manipulation of material, mass, light, space, that appeals above all to the senses, now only has to look good. And I think this is something which I think is a substantial problem for architecture. That as we become less engaged and less confident in physical results, and that the elements of architecture become more synthetic and more reliable, then we replace that confidence with a lack of confidence, and that lack of confidence, I believe, it's a very subtle point, is that, not very subtle at all, that, we move into the idea of shape and form as a sort of substitute. I mean, just as an example, and I would say, I make this point because working with historic buildings, you can't avoid the materiality. You are continuously very close to stuff. And I would also say that in Germany, there is still a construction culture, and that this engagement that we have had in these projects, I think, has been very important, and to some degree has given us confidence. And some of those things are banal. I mean, for instance, one of the biggest struggles on this project was to build this without any expansion joints. There are no expansion joints. Now that takes a sort of commitment and a negotiation of risk, and it's more difficult. It's not impossible, it's more difficult. Now, it's quite difficult to argue in a normal way that, around a project table, why not just have some expansion joints, and what's the problem? I mean, just slap them in. Every 3 meters, it's fine. But at that point, you've lost something substantial. If you try and sit at a table which is about value engineering and argue about maintaining no expansion joints, you have a real problem. I mean, you're very, very unlikely to win that battle. And that's quite a big battle, but those battles go all the way down the line. So, I think it's something that we've experienced and enjoyed in this double coincidence of German building culture, which I think still takes construction seriously and is willing to look for solutions, and also building in a historic environment where the materiality of the building is actually often valued not just by the architect, but by the client, and also by the contractor. If you're working on a restoration project, the contractors are delicate. They're not listening to pop music; they're listening to classical music, and they're not with jackhammers. They're with little things that you clean your ears with. So the whole carefulness of construction starts changing. So the center of our work in Berlin has been the reconstruction of the Neues Museum. And as I showed you before, it was completely bombed, and we, over 12 years, planned and restored it in the face of enormous dialogue and opposition at some times. But my intention is not to talk about Neues Museum. I'm just refer to it briefly. I mean, it is the major project. It is the project about reconstruction. And again, I would say that the materialization of this project was incredibly important. On one hand, it's an intellectual concept. It's the idea that you don't imitate what's lost, but you protect what's lost, and you try and complete what's lost. You try and give sense and meaning to what's lost. I mean, so intellectually, it's a very clear and straightforward strategy, which is well understood in archaeology. It's well understood in the repair of paintings, and that's not a problem. However, I think that the reason that the project has been successful and has been enjoyed by the public is because of its material qualities. And that was something that, I mean, there were two lessons I learned on this project. One was the engagement that it required, because Berlin is a very engaged city. It has 5 daily newspapers, and during the period of this project, I think we had more than 600 newspaper articles. You cannot avoid that engagement, and it's a rather positive process in a way, and it becomes part of your responsibility as an architect. The second lesson, or the second thing I took away very positively, was that, as I was saying before, in one's cynical moments, you sort of feel that no one can tell the difference between these tactile and physical things, but actually the whole success of Neues Museum has been the fact that people respond to the building, not only intellectually, but actually in terms of its tactile qualities, which a ruin strangely gives you a lot of. So I now want to move very quickly to the two projects. The first is the James Simon Gallery. Here's the master plan of the Museum Island. We were, having won the competition of the rebuilding of Neues Museum, which is here, we were appointed master planners to come up with a plan for the whole island, and that involved the building of a new building here to replace, let me read a little bit. The need for a new structure on this piece of land, previously occupied by the warehouses and the director's house built by Schinkel, was stimulated by the need to create connections between the museums and to provide visitor infrastructure that has never existed. Before the war, the buildings were connected above ground with bridges. This route, if it was to be reinstated, would have run through the most fragile rooms of the Neues Museum. And as we anticipate large visitor numbers to run between the archaeological collections, we insisted that these bridges were not rebuilt, but instead we connect the basements. So, as part of that, we had to find another way of connecting, and also the museum complex, which are these 5 buildings, which all sit independently with their doors facing in different directions. The Alters Museum faces south. The Neues Museum faces east onto this common space with the National Gallery. But then if you want to go to the Pergamon, you have to come off the island, go down here and across here. Then if you want to go to the Bode, you have to go down here and go here. So although they are neighbors, they all sit with their backs to each other. And historically, there was a bridge here, there was a bridge here, and there was a bridge here. we can't put this one back because of the railway, and we insisted that you couldn't put one back here because of the historic rooms. So it required a new intervention, and on top of that, the buildings have never had, the whole complex is short of a number of infrastructural issues, such as auditorium, temporary exhibition space. So we worked on a sort of feasibility study for a new building. It would be the first new building on the museum island. And the building had to contain a whole number of infrastructural elements that didn't add up to being a museum. It actually added up to being a sort of entrance and a facility, shops, restaurant, auditorium, temporary exhibition. That became it also had to start to link into the Pergamon to compensate for what I've just shown you, that we need to sort of find ways of connecting the northern buildings to the southern buildings. So all of a sudden, this strange volume had to be plugged into the Pergamon, should somehow connect underground to the National Gallery, to the Noise Museum. Not really be a museum, but sort of have an identity. So it was very interesting. When this went out into the public realm, there was a sort of cool response that no one sort of tore it down. I mean, we did develop elevations and things for it, but it was clear that there was not, somehow, it hadn't captured anybody, and also we hadn't become convinced ourselves about what this thing was. It literally sits so this is Schinkel's plan. The Pergamon now sits here. This is the warehouse that Schinkel built, and this is the director's office of Schinkel. So there were always buildings here. There's the kink in the river. There's the Eisnerbrücke here. The gallery house I showed you is here, and the Noise Museum is there. So the project was on hold, and then it received financing. And before we started redesigning, we spent 3 months with the general director of the museums and the president of the foundation, brainstorming about what this building should be. And this childlike sketch actually is something I did in a meeting to sort of say, actually what we really want here is something like Mises' National Gallery, because what we want is a space more than a building. We want a room. And of course, this wonderful building, which functions rather poorly as a gallery, does have this wonderful representational space that everyone struggles to use. Incidentally, we are now in the process of restoring this building. It's another project where we've been given the responsibility to effectively take this thing to pieces for 5 years and put it back together so that it looks like it did at the beginning. But it's a wonderful project to work on, and just in terms of literally trying to solve issues that Mies didn't solve, but without destroying his details, because then you've destroyed the building. Anyway, this was a reference to us in the sense of saying, actually what we want here is not a solid building, we want something that accepts people in. And of course, Mies was inspired by Schinkel, and of course, Schinkel's great Altes Museum also has clues, and the clues on the island in terms of this language of porticos, staircases, a sort of architecture of the sort of interstitial. And this wonderful view is of a space within the Altes Museum. We're on the balcony. These people are actually inside the building, looking over the Lustgarten. There's the Schloss I'm pointing to the image that I can see. these people are standing inside the building. There's the Lustgarten, there's the Schloss, but they haven't gone through a door. They've just gone through this portico, and they're up here. So, and this was the first two-story museum, and it's an incredibly clever public building because Schinkel was already bringing the public space into the building. So this became a sort of inspiration for us. And I pointed out before that there is pre-existing this wonderful device, this colonnade, which forms the edge of the Spree. In fact, this piece of the river at the moment, the canal, is the only place where architecture doesn't hit the water. So this colonnade brings you all the way to here. Historically, it stopped here. It runs in front of the Neues Museum. We rebuilt this. And it runs around there. So what we became interested in is to knit ourselves into this system. And so the project sort of dematerialized from being a volume into a series of elements. The first being a base, which is extracted from the base of the pergamon and forms a new canal wall as goes around the whole island. The second is this colonnade, and then the third is this sort of portico. So the building disappears into this architecture, which has a sort of classical reference. This is within our own biography. This is the Marbach Literature Museum, which we built 10 years ago or so, near Stuttgart. The first, probably in the south. I mean, after the war, it was really unacceptable to build any architecture that had any sort of classical allusion. The National Socialists had somehow confiscated this architecture, and it was sort of untouchable. So this was, our sort of bringing back onto the table the idea of a sort of classical architecture, and in a way, that's what we're doing with this. I mean, it's not, they're not really columns, but they are load supporting. So in fact, it's also an archaic architecture because every one of those mini columns is structural. So the facade becomes very materialized. It also creates spaces which are, again, interstitial. So the project expanded out of this. This is the plan, so you can see this is the ground floor. You can see how the colonnade wraps around. So because the first responsibility of this building is as a connector. So it connects on the ground floor. You can go up these steps. There's the auditorium. There's the temporary exhibition. You can enter here and you can go downstairs. And this is, or you can go upstairs. If you go upstairs, then you can connect into the Pergamon Museum. And if you go downstairs, you can connect into the basement areas, into the promenade and the lower levels of the museums. And therefore, this building presents itself as something which has a sort of classical aspiration, but at the same time walks a very fine line between being a sort of minimal construction, nearly an archaic construction, and something which seems to be extracted from the historic context of the museum island. That's how it will finally look. And going full circle, a sort of strange thing that we did at the very end, before we closed the National Gallery, we did this installation of putting 144 columns into Mises' columnless space. as a tribute to the lost column, the column that has somehow been lost in history. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through this project. It's simpler to explain. This is the Jumex, center of Mexico. Everything that we had in Berlin in terms of an urban setting is completely different here. This is a mishmash of everything. We even have a live railway track running every few hours past through this public garden. It goes at about 2 miles an hour, so it's not dangerous, but and it makes a huge amount of noise. This was an industrial area. The train still services that industrial area. Carlos Slim owns the whole area and has gradually built it out. And Fernando Romero built for Carlos Slim this museum here for Carlos Slim's own collection. And we were given a triangle. Carlos Slim invited my client to build his own building there. The physical context of the site is difficult, but the environmental context of the climatic context of Mexico City is fantastic. It's a benign climate. It's always 20-something degrees. It goes up and down a little bit, but you can take an enormous advantage of the climate. This is the Anthropological Museum, which does exactly that, by Vasquez. I think one of the great museums. The main circulation is through the courtyard because you can always get away from the rain, but actually climatically you can keep things open. Of course, we know Barragan, we know this whole idea of inside, outside, and again within our own biography, I would say this is the second building I ever did in Japan. I was very heavily influenced by traditional Japanese architecture, about sort of interstitial space, outside space that's on the threshold of the buildings. And of course, I was influenced by Tadao Ando's interpretation of traditional Japanese architecture. So here's our site, here's our first pathetic scratchings around trying to find a way of building in this context. And amongst these sort of giant, intimidating volumes, so we worked our way around from the inside, trying to think what sequence of rooms we could make, what delicate little building, and at the same time aware of these gargantuan monsters hemming us in on all sides, trying to optimize this strange triangular site, gradually finding our way towards something which has something in it. Having said that, there's a struggle on the inside of the building. The client's desperate for big rooms, not broken up rooms, so the biggest rooms that we can get onto the site. So here you see the beginning of a project. We've established a sort of base. Public space in Mexico City is difficult, and difficult to maintain, but maybe we thought if we create a sort of semi-public space by just going up a bit, we're starting to get a volume which asserts itself. You can start to see big windows and a skylight. We then tried to work out how, it's a vertical museum. In a vertical museum, you've got to reward people when they get to the top, and they've got to have, daylight. There's got to be something that happens when you get to the top. This triangular form actually makes it very difficult because you always get this sort of perspectival consequence, which you don't really want. It becomes the geometry starts dominating. This is St. Louis, where we've did a daylight top-lit space, which is very beautiful, but the grid is orthogonal. It's very easy to handle. And here's Diego Rivera's house, and studio, which sort of became, everyone's favorite little house in Mexico. And then you're thinking about the roof profile, and of course also, in a way, one is sort of worried about the assertion. I mean, I'm being honest here that I felt under a certain pressure that after everything I've just said beforehand, I sort of felt the shape was important. I know I shouldn't admit it, but we are in some sort of territory here which is already defined by the battle of shapes. We have the shape of all shapes across the road. So I then felt, there was two things that came together. One is a lack of, it's a real struggle with how do you do top light, and how do we give the building silhouette. So we started to work on a roof light solution. We've done that in Wakefield. This is the building we did for Wakefield for the Hepworth collection, using a sort of a non-rectangular space, which is right nice. So there was one issue about the roof. The other is about the ground. How can we make this building as open as possible? The client is very, very conscious. It's a private institution in a way, but he wants it to be a public building. There's two ways. In essence, up here is a treasure box. We don't need too many windows. We don't want too many windows in here. And the idea was to try and make the lower floors as public as possible. And I was interested in making a sort of useless room here that wasn't a real gallery. Rather like Mises' National Gallery space, something which you'd learn how to use, but would be a dialogue between. It would allow you to look into the museum. Flipping forward, then we started to feel that maybe lifting the building off the ground. This is an exaggeration here. We've lifted it too far, but we started to think about if the treasure boxes are 2 floors above, could we then find ways of undercrofting? Here's Pavilion Suisse, Le Corbe, the modernist idea of lifting. And then there was another idea, which is also about framing the views around the site. So here it sort of goes. It's all happening, all in one time. So we've got a plinth. We've lifted the building, but we've created a sort of skirt. So we've lifted the building and then we brought it down, so to 2.3 or something like that. So that, because it's a pretty ugly context around here, and so the idea was, in this Japanese way of, in a way, framing that view. And here's the section with the 2 gallery floors, the treasure box in a way, the vitrine, which is sort of open to the public, and this sort of undercroft. And that explains the building, and here it is sort of built, trying to battle its way against its neighbors and assert itself. These are very weird photographs from a helicopter taken by Johan Ban, which make it look like a model. And again, interestingly, going back to my building obsession, what was so interesting in Mexico was that we built with builders. There was a father and son team that did the stonework. Everything was laid out on site. I mean, if you look at this photo, this isn't a lighting effect. Sorry. That stone is properly laid. I mean, that's one block folded out. So every layer is laid out as a strata. I mean, unbelievably well done. All of the window frames were made by another small company. The doors were made by, so we were working all the time with the builders. I mean, it was an enormous relief. And we were completely surprised at the quality of construction that we got because of the engagement with the people who made the building. Because at the beginning, everyone said, you can't do good concrete in Mexico. You can't do good metalwork in Mexico. You can't do, So here's the skirt. So you enter, in a way, you've entered the building when, this is the train track, by the way, here. You've entered the building when you've gone up these steps and you're already on the threshold. The second threshold is, as it were, going under the skirt. And the third threshold is entering the front. So there is no front, it seems like there's no front door, which again is an attempt to try and make the building more public. Here's the framed view. Here's the lobby. So fine, this is the next threshold, if you like. And again, in Mexico, you can leave these doors open. So here's the plan. There's the plinth, the course. That's the glass wall, and there are 3 large doors which are open. So, and there's the cafe is actually outside. So we've blurred that. So there's the door open to the cafe. So it looks like you're outside looking inside, but actually you're inside looking outside. And then moving up, this is the vitrine space. This idea of a room which is not an auditorium, it's not an exhibition space, it does nothing properly. We refused to sort of turn it into a well-performing space, so we didn't crank it up in terms of it being a great place to do lectures or a great place to do exhibitions. It's a mediocre place to do all of those things. But on that basis, it can do a lot. And so it's a glass box inside the bigger box, and so this is a public balcony, and that's the empty, useless room, becoming slightly more useful. And actually, it is completely used. I mean, it's used for conferences, it's used for discussions, it's used for dance, it's used for puppet shows, parties. I mean, it's continuously. It has a big curtain, so we can close it off. But it was a very nice. Then, if you go up the building, we get the more conventional spaces, the 3rd floor, and then the top floor, which is lit, the biggest room we could possibly get onto the site, with this spectacular top light, really beautiful top light, and these walls are temporary walls. The opening exhibition. That's it. Last slide. Thank you.